Good afternoon. I wanted to do an extra interview today only because what's going on in the economy is so apropos and so important to all of us. First, we heard about what was going on with the possibility of a recession. We heard about inflation. We heard about interest rates going up. Then we start to see it all start to happen where they're now at 5.5. Cost of food is up. And then little by little, it started to level off, possibly even drop a little bit. Rates are still pretty much as is. But I figured, me being the novice in this, if you recall, we interviewed Mr. Larry Thompson, the attorney, who also is very involved with the Federal Reserve, and he can explain his role. But more importantly, at such an important time where the debt ceiling is upon us literally within days, I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to talk to Larry a little about his thoughts, what the government options are, what's going to happen, the effects if it does, it doesn't happen. And then we have a little wager, Larry and I, in terms of where rates will be at the end of the year. So we'll get into the wager and see who wins it. But Larry, I want to thank you for being here because I know you're leaving to go out of town. Larry is probably one of the most affluent attorneys in the Federal Reserve System and has been doing this a few years, just to say the least. And if you haven't listened to any of his lectures or go on his podcasts or just Google him, I think you'll be quite impressed by what you hear. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's jump right into it. First, tell us a little about you and why you're here today because of what you know.
Well, one small correction I'll make.
Oh.
I'm not with the Federal Reserve. I'm with the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York. I sit on their board, and I'm the vice chairman of the board. So that's that. And prior to that, I was at a company called the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, which clears all of the securities that are traded on the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, as well as the over-the-counter market as well. We also handle, or DTC handles, commercial paper and muni bonds as well. And last year they did approximately, I think, 2.5 quadrillion in market value of securities that
it's an insane number.
That they cleared. Yeah. Well, a quadrillion, just to give you some idea, is a 1 with 19 zeros behind it. So it's a big number. So they clear a lot. And I was the chairman, vice chairman of the board, vice chairman of the company, as well as the general counsel at DTC. Thank you for having me.
So I feel stupid. Only because who could remember all of those things? And that's just a few of the things you've done. But right now the world is, and the United States, but of course when the United States sneezes, the world gets a cold.
Absolutely.
In terms of what's going on, you know, is it newspapers, the press panicking people? We know that this is not something that's new. We've hit this debt ceiling before in the past, and at the last minute something does get resolved. But I think more importantly, people don't understand what this really means when they talk about if they don't increase the debt ceiling, the debt limit. Let's start with just a definition of what that is.
Well, that's an interesting concept. The debt ceiling bill was passed by Congress, I believe, in 1921. And the idea was it was a way for the government to get its arms around its spending limits. Prior to that, there was no debt ceiling issue. And everybody relied on the fact that the U.S. in the 14th Amendment says that it will pay all of its bills. So you had the 14th Amendment already there saying that the U.S. would stand behind all of its bills. What the debt ceiling did was basically cut off the ability of the U.S. Treasury to go out and add additional debt to, in the form of doing U.S. bonds or T-bills as they're called, any kind of borrowing by the federal government in order to be able to pay its ongoing bills. So the key thing on that would be Social Security payments might be cut, Medicare payments might be cut, all of the things that you have that are entitlements in the U.S. government would not be things that the U.S. government could borrow funds on in order to pay those bills as they become due. So that's essentially what the debt limit
So
issue is.
is the debt service part of a yearly budgetary process, or is it just a number that's set at a point in time, and then over time we could get to it, exceed it, not meet it? How much time is there? They're going to raise, let's say they raise it June 1st to X. How long is that good for?
Well, typically, when they do the debt ceiling, you know, there have been twice in the last 12 years, there have been debt ceilings that have been hit. 2011, when Barack Obama was president, you had a debt ceiling issue. At that particular time, you had a divided Congress similar to what you got right now, and there was a deal that was cut, as you may recall, between the then Vice President, Joe Biden, and the then head of the Senate as the Speaker, because the Speaker at the time was a Republican by the name of Mitch McConnell. So those two cut the deal, and basically that gave the country about 5 or 6 years of breathing room before the next debt ceiling was hit, because they raised it by approximately $2.5 trillion. You know, it's again a function of being able to go out, borrow the funds to be able to pay your debts. The other thing that could happen, obviously, is if you get tax revenues that the Treasury receives, you can also begin to exceed what you need in terms of what you need to borrow, because that revenue from the taxes obviously reduces what you need to borrow in order to pay your bills, to move forward. So the debt ceiling at that time moved to 2016, and there was another deal that was cut, of course, by 2016. There was a Republican who was the president, and the House and the Senate were both controlled by the Republicans, and Donald Trump pushed through a debt ceiling bill without any kind of cuts. He also passed a tax bill later that year as the president, and was able to get the debt ceiling pushed off until approximately 2021. In 2021, you had the House and the Senate controlled by the Democrats, and the Democrats actually pushed through another debt ceiling bill, which, you know, it limits what it was. It wasn't quite 2.5 trillion as it was before. It was more like $1 trillion up. And so we're back right now on June 1st, which is where the Treasury Secretary Yellen has said that we'll run out of the ability to pay our bills if we don't go out and borrow some additional funds, or we get additional funds in another format. There is a debate as to whether or not it's going to be June 1st or whether or not it's going to be June 8th. And there is a school of thought that if you could make it into the middle of June, when a lot of tax revenues are due, then you can probably wait until August of this year before the debt ceiling is breached again. But as you have pointed out, Bob, the negotiators, both for the president and for Speaker of the House McCarthy, have said that they are making some progress, and they would like to go ahead and try to pass a debt ceiling bill by the June 1st deadline and get it signed. Unfortunately, the Senate is now on recess, and the House is due to go on recess early next week for the Memorial Day holiday.
So it tightens it up. So a question then, which you know we talk about, if I needed money and I ran out of money, I go to a bank, hopefully I borrow it, and basically that's what we're really doing. This country is running out of money to pay its bills, to pay its expenses, debt service, so we have to go out and borrow more.
Yep.
But there is a need to pay that back.
There is.
So the question then becomes, and I guess the expression, they print money, where does the additional income come from to pay this additional debt?
Well, I mean, typically it would come from taxes, that all of us pay to the government,
Right.
that is used to service the debt that you just referred to, and also pay down things like Social Security payments, Medicare payments, and other bills that the government may have.
But then there would have to be the anticipation that if you raise this debt ceiling by $2.5 trillion, then you're anticipating there's an additional $2.5 trillion of income or cash flow positive coming into the coffers of the Treasury.
Well, you could do it that way, or you could look at spending cuts. You know, the
Which
two
is
ways.
what's going on now,
Right.
I think.
I mean, you can always reduce what you spend so that you don't have to necessarily have to have all of that. So you can look at the entitlement programs that we have. You can look at the defense budget, you know, which you could cut back upon as well as ways to be able to reduce, you know, your payout. Now,
Let me, not to interrupt, but I just want to ask you a question about this. There's a Ukraine war obviously going on. We are funding billions of dollars to help them in aid. This is not a budgeted item because obviously who knew 2 years ago there was going to be this expense. So this obviously creates the drain on the funds and creates a more quick need for the debt ceiling to be raised, wouldn't it? I mean, something of that kind of size.
well, you had two things that I think that happened in that regard. First of all, you had tax revenues that were cut by, as you may recall, just before he lost the 2020 election, you know, President Trump. It's amazing how sometimes you don't want to say a name.
Yeah, yeah.
But in any event, President Trump cut taxes. And that obviously cut the revenue that the government was going to receive. The other thing that happened, obviously, was the pandemic. Because one of the ways that we dealt with the pandemic was giving a lot of people funds during the pandemic to pay off. Now, that resulted in two things. One, meaning that the debt ceiling number that had been put out there in 2021 by the then president, you know, was shortened considerably because you now had expenditures that you hadn't planned on. Obviously, one of those expenditures that you hadn't planned on was also the war in the Ukraine.
Right.
So those things are, you know, taxing to the government and have added to the overall burden that the U.S. has in terms of what it's going to do.
So during the pandemic, it's like any other business like we have on this island as a microcosm of the world. Our expenses didn't change, but our income reduced drastically.
Yep.
So I'm assuming in the government the same thing. During the pandemic, people weren't working, rent wasn't paid, any taxes weren't there, and we were giving out much more in aid. So it was almost like a double-edged sword. The
Yeah,
expenses didn't change, if not they increased.
Well, I would argue that the expenses did increase.
Yeah,
I mean,
they'd have
if
to,
you look
sure.
at the bills that were passed, the payroll, taxes that were given to people in order to make up for the fact that a lot of people lost their jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about 21 million people who were basically put out of a job overnight, just like what happened here on this island, you know, because of the restrictions that were put in place in terms of not only wearing a mask, but people not being able to gather at restaurants and things of that sort. Reducing your revenue was an expense that happened. And in addition to that, we wanted to feed those people, so we gave them funds. A lot of those funds went into the banks. A lot of those funds didn't earn very much interest.
Yeah.
You know, interest rates were very low, as you may recall, because the government cut interest rates to a very bare minimum, 25 basis points, basically above zero. That was the rate that the U.S. had. It was almost a negative interest rate. And in fact, there were certain governmental agencies that were running at that time stress tests as if the U.S. was going to go into a negative interest rate, which is what Europe was actually
yeah, it happened. Well, I remember, and it wasn't that long ago, oil, they were selling oil reserves. They would pay you for some of the options on it because nobody wanted the oil at that time, if you recall. And then now it's up to $70 a barrel. But it's been a very weird roller coaster ride. But, you know, the question I asked, because you raised when you spoke, obviously they're going to come to a solution of some sort.
I would hope so.
Yeah, I would hope so. And whatever that new number becomes, we get the money from borrowing from somewhere. Where is that somewhere? Where do we derive those additional funds?
Interestingly enough, most of the U.S. treasuries, besides being bought by U.S. citizens, were also bought by foreign investors, most of whom are in China, which is where we're spending most of our tax dollars these days on our defense mechanism so that we can protect the folks against China, because everybody's predicting that sometime in the next 20 years there will be a war between the U.S. and China. I'm hopeful that that won't occur.
Yeah. Economic war is already happening. That goes without saying. But okay, so let me just ask you on that point. They're buying treasuries, but today they're buying treasuries that are paying 4%, 3.5%.
Well, it depends on which ones that they're buying.
Well,
right?
It's in a range higher than it had been.
Yeah.
Now, over the next 24 months, let's say the treasuries go back down to 2, as a scenario, 2.5. Now there's a spread where we're paying out at the high rate, but the new money is at a lower rate. Yet so that does accelerate some of the deficiency we're going to get created by this new lending, isn't it?
Well, it could. It could definitely have a negative effect on what's going to happen with the borrowing and the ability of the U.S. to borrow the funds that it needs in order to continue to finance the government payouts that it wants to do. But you got to remember, when interest rates were really very low, China was still buying U.S. treasuries.
Yeah.
And my suspicion is that they will continue to buy U.S. treasuries because the dollar is the reserve monetary capital that everybody uses right now. Mm-hmm. So U.S. treasuries are in high demand, and even if there is a default by the U.S., treasuries will still be bought.
They'll be bought.
Yeah, that's my view.
So come June 1st, 2nd, 3rd, they don't meet an agreement. Obviously, there's a default on a lot of debt.
There would be.
The benefit to either party is catastrophic because there is no benefit if they don't resolve it.
Well, quite frankly, I think if they don't resolve it and the U.S. defaults, there will be a recession of a magnitude that nobody is really predicting.
Exactly.
And you're now getting places like Moody's, for instance, that are saying that if there's a recession because the U.S. default, it's going to put out of work 7 million people. In addition to that, you would think that a lot of retirees are not going to receive their Social Security payments, and a lot of people who depend upon Medicare to get their medical benefits won't be receiving those payments either. So the knock-on effect is going to be, I think, catastrophic.
Absolutely.
For the U.S. And as I said once before, if the U.S. catches a cold, the rest of the world catches pneumonia.
Exactly.
So,
at this time, yes.
It would be catastrophic not only for the U.S. but for the world economy, and that is not a very healthy thing for it to happen.
Well, it seems the market in the last week has become a little bit more optimistic that it seems to be coming closer to a resolve.
Well, I think that's because both sides have been trying to put their best foot forward, not to avoid a default. So, the word is, at least if you listen to the pundits, is that Biden is thinking of a compromise to accept some of the spending cuts. Now, remember, there were spending cuts that were done in 2016 as well, but there were spending cuts that were going to happen in the future. So, you can do the same thing here. You can postpone those spending cuts to a later presidency, right? When you're not the president, any longer. And one of the things you can do is you can also up the tax rate. So they're gonna, in 2025, the tax cuts that President Trump put through actually expire. So you're gonna get an increase in taxes anyway in 2025. You could probably either speed that up or you can wait until then, and you can put in some more spending cuts into the future and you can try to balance your budget in that fashion.
Well, I imagine with an election year coming up, neither side wants to look like they created a default.
Well,
I mean, obviously for either side politically, it's not the smartest thing in the world.
I think a default will further politicize this country
Yes.
in a way that would be detrimental to any future negotiations.
Yeah.
Because once you use that option of actually going into a default situation, first of all, I think at that point, to avoid a default, I think President Biden would invoke the 14th Amendment. Now, that in and of itself, I think, is a very dangerous thing because it would lead to a period of uncertainty because you don't know what the court is going to decide.
Mm-hmm.
The court could decide that the 14th Amendment, obviates the 1921 law on the debt ceiling because the law was unconstitutional. That would be the argument.
And that's what the 14th Amendment does.
Yeah, would basically say, 14th Amendment is part of the U.S. Constitution, and so the 1921 law, which has never been tested in court, would be obviated because of that. You also run the risk, obviously, of a recession in those cases because uncertainty, I think, especially with the court being as divided as it is, with 6 conservative and 3 liberal justices in the court, you don't know where the court is going to land on
and
this.
It's not going to happen overnight either.
No, it's going to take months for it to be resolved. And during that time period, those who buy the U.S. debt may not know whether or not they're going to get paid. So people may stop buying the U.S. debt.
Sure.
Tremendous uncertainties.
So hopefully things will, I guess we're going to find out very shortly.
I think we need to find out by this weekend.
Yeah, I think they're going to have to because the first is around the corner.
Well, the first is around the corner, but more importantly, with Congress going into recess, in order to make certain that you get everybody there, you got to go through a lot of procedural hoops from a congressional standpoint. You'd have to call back the House. You'd have to get all 100 senators to agree that they're going to come back in and vote on the bill that is presented to them. And as you may recall, the majority leader in the House, McCarthy, actually agreed that his members didn't have to vote on anything for 72 hours to give them time to read it. So, you not only can call them back, but you're going to have to give them at least 3 days of time to read the bill and decide whether or not they understand it in order to vote for it. Now, you also run the risk that his conservative wing, unless they think they've gotten the kind of cuts that they want, may decide to vote against it. Mm-hmm. And that would doom any kind of deal in the House.
In the House.
The Senate, on the other hand, is controlled by the Democrats, who I think would probably be able to pass any bill that they want to.
Yeah, it's the Republican, and it's the right wing of the Republican that could be the problem. But I guess we're going to find this out in a few days.
Well, we're going to find out a number of things in a few days.
Now, I want to start to get into real quickly, because I appreciate your time, the interest rates. What type of effect does this have on what the Feds are going to do with interest rates? Well, giving a sense, let's just say it doesn't look good for a resolve.
Yeah, I think the Fed is going to be a very divided Federal Reserve, which is what you're talking about.
Yes.
It's going to be very divided at its next meeting, its June meeting. I would have thought that they would have been finished with the cuts. And if you listen to Chairman Powell's press conference, he basically said that. However, there have been some dissents recently from other Fed folks on the FOMC who have been saying that they really think that another rate increase is necessary in order to tap down the inflationary power that we got going on right now, the inflation. And so I think there's going to be a divided Fed. My own view is interest rates probably won't go up for the rest of the year. I think Chairman Powell has got a strong personality and controls most of the votes on the FOMC. And I think he's going to get his way, and there won't be any further increases. I've told you that. That's part of our bet.
Right. But do you think there could be a decrease by the end of the year?
I don't think they're going to cut interest rates either.
No.
My own view is that they're going to leave it at the rate that they got right now, which is a little bit above 5%, between 5 and 5.25. If they go up by another 25 basis points, it would really tip over to almost a 5.5%, and would mean that in a year and a half they've gone up from 25 basis points above zero to 5.5. That's a pretty steep curve, and it's never happened in history before.
Never.
Even under other presidents who were chairmen of the Federal Reserve, who were very, very hawkish in wanting to bring down inflation, you didn't see those kind of level of increases.
Yeah. So, assuming you're right, and it's a compromise.
We'll find out.
I felt it was going to drop a little bit, but not increase. But if it stays as is, how does that affect the possibility of a soft landing, a slight recession, a big recession?
Well, I think right now, if you look at what's happening with the S&P 500, the S&P 500 is just a few points below what its threshold has been for a long time, the 4,200. It hasn't breached that in quite a long period of time. I think if it breaches the 4,200 level, and look, I'm not telling people to put money in the stock market. I'm not a broker. I don't do any of that stuff. And I'm not predicting what's going to happen in the future. Talk to your own broker about that. But in my view, if it goes over 4,200, then I think it's going to be a breakout. And I think it's because everybody thinks that inflation is going to be tamped down at the present level. And probably beginning in year 2024, the Fed will start cutting interest rates.
Yeah, and I think that's what, well, because if I look at the NASDAQ's almost at a high. The
NASDAQ
Dow
is at a high.
It is at a high.
Yeah.
S&P is very close. Dow, of course, that's a different category of stocks. So those companies would get hit the hardest at this point. But, you know, we're at such a crossroads in the whole economy that I would have to say that 10 years ago, I can't think of any couple that went out to dinner and talked about the economy, interest rates, and ceilings. And today, it's almost the common topic. That, I mean, look what the media has done, and look what the world has done. And I'd have to say the biggest impetus to it was the pandemic, obviously, because that accelerated whatever is going to happen happening. I mean, I look at New York, where I go up there quite frequently, and they haven't come back to work. Those office buildings are still empty.
Yeah, commercial real estate is really taking a hard hit.
And that's corporate America.
Well, it's corporate America, but it's in particular important for the Northeast region and New York City. And you're correct. The commercial real estate market in New York is in very bad shape.
Yes.
Because the number of people going back to work in the Northeast region is actually lagged the national average.
Is it?
Yeah.
And yet, in Florida, they are getting the highest rental rates in the corporate office buildings in downtown Miami that they have ever seen, and it's one of the highest rents in the country right now on Brickell in some of these new buildings. It's amazing to me where Florida, and Dade County especially, not Florida, but this Brickell area, these rents are 20, 30% higher than New York right now.
Well, it just goes to show you how much there's been a shift in jobs from New York, the New York region, to the southern half of the eastern part of the U.S.
And I think also coming here, there's certainly it's tax savings to these companies. New York taxes has the additional taxes on it. And also I think there's we spoilt the workforce because, as an example, I have a son that works and he's looking for a job particularly. He has one, but he's looking for another one, and he wants to see how many days a week he can work from home. And I laughed to myself because I said, you know, who ever heard of applying for a job where you don't have to go to the workplace?
Well, the pandemic
changed. That's what I'm saying.
Changed a lot of work habits because a lot of employers told people to work from home, and so they built out their capabilities to have remote work done. That is something that has changed the world. And in the case of New York City, may have doomed the city.
I don't see, I mean, I do a lot of business in the Rockefeller Foundation, and I go up there once a month. I have meetings up there, and I will tell you, I'm sure you've been there, the floor is like a football stadium. And in a floor that would hold 1,000 people, if there's 20 people there, it's a lot.
Yeah, well,
it's frightening.
We have our, as I mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York. We have an office building in New York. We go back for meetings in New York. So I see what's there. The homeless problem is very severe in New York. It's a very dangerous place because of the crime situation that you have.
Well, there's no police. You don't see the police anymore.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. Well, I really appreciate you being here, and I don't know that anyone has the answer to what's happening. We all hope that come the next few days there's going to be a resolve of that. Hopefully the interest doesn't go up anymore, possibly down, but stabilizes. But more importantly, I want to thank you because so many of these questions are asked of me, or people, as you walk, you have conversations with your friends. But you're in the middle of it. You have such an understanding, not because you can decide what the end result is or can figure it out, but so many people don't understand the terms that they're hearing today. And depending on what TV station you listen to, you get a totally different opinion. You know, if you listen to Fox, it's one. If it's MSNBC, it's another opinion. But the truth of the matter is, I don't think anybody knows. I think the hope and the anticipation is they're not going to let this not get resolved.
Well, as I said earlier, if there is a default by the U.S., then the world economy is going to take a big hit.
That's right.
That's not good for
and
anybody.
Nobody wants that responsibility.
And I don't think either one of the parties want to be responsible for the consequences of what would happen.
Not in an election year especially. Well, I want to thank you, Larry. I know you're leaving town. You're going up to New York.
I am.
Have a wonderful, safe trip.
Thank you.
And hopefully when you come back, all this is a little bit behind us.
Some of it will be.
Some of it.
Thank you, Bob.
I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. I thought this would be a great opportunity while we have our neighbor who happens to live on the island have all this insight and knowledge. And I thought it would be great if we could just share it with the island. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on the island. Have a good day.